And get started. We might have some other people come in tonight. We have a true interdisciplinary, which is what we were hoping for, a true interdisciplinary group here tonight. We have people from the law school, from the library school, and from the business school, which was our aim in doing this. So thanks very much to Sam and Anita from CUA SLA for organizing this. And for those of you who don't know me, because I know that not everyone in this room knows me, my name is Bruce Rosenstein. I am an adjunct in the library school. I teach a course called the Special Library Information Center. I've taught at the school pretty much every summer since 1996. And to go a little bit further back in my background, I worked for USA Today newspaper for 21 years, from 1987 to 2008. I was both a corporate librarian back when they had them. They don't have librarians anymore. I was a corporate librarian, and I also wrote for the money section of the paper. I wrote about business and management books for the last 12 years that I was at the paper. And I had a lot of writing experience before, yes, please, before I became a librarian. But that was all actually about music, and that's another topic that if anyone wants to talk to me about another time, I will. But you know, I kind of left that world for the most part and went into the world of library and information science, but also in business, which certainly came in handy in the years I worked at USAT, and then led to since I had a very big interest in writing about business and business-related topics, and that led to writing about business and management books for the paper. And by the way, everything I wrote virtually for USA Today is still online and for free. You can get on the USAT website. Some of it on my website. My website is brucerosenstein.com. I do have links to some of my Drucker-related articles on the website. So tonight we're going to talk about the Peter Drucker perspective on information, knowledge, and business. I've written 2 books on Drucker. This is the most recent one. It's called Create Your Future, the Peter Drucker Way. This came out in 2013. It's published by McGraw-Hill. The previous book is called Living in More Than One World, How Peter Drucker's Wisdom Can Inspire and Transform Your Life. That came out in 2009. It was published by a very good independent publisher in San Francisco called Barrett Kohler. There's a lot of information on my books, on those books on the website, and coincidentally, there are the 2 books on screen. So Drucker, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Drucker in a moment before we get into the meat of the presentation, but Drucker was a legendary figure. Died in 95, in 2005. And so how did I come to write about him? I did a lot of research, but beyond that, I also had a lot of personal access to him before he died. I wrote about him for USA Today. Any book that came out over this period of maybe 12 years, either about him or by him, I wrote about. So I interviewed people who wrote books about him, and then I interviewed Drucker himself. And Drucker, another reason why I felt this should be so multidisciplinary tonight is that Drucker also had a following in the library world. He was the keynote speaker at Special Library Association Annual Conference in Los Angeles in 2002. And so when I was out there for that conference, partially to be at the conference, but partially to be there because Drucker was going to be there, and I interviewed him for a feature story. And so that feature story went so well, I felt, that I got emboldened to write a book about him. And I decided I wanted to write a book about Drucker and the individual as opposed to Drucker and the organization. And so not too long after the article came out, I called him. He lived in Claremont, California. I called him and said, I want to write a book about you and the individual. I'd like to come out to Claremont to talk to you. Because I knew remember, he was, at that point, he was what, like 92, and I knew this wasn't going to go on forever, and I knew I needed that access to him beyond just, you know, calling him or whatever. So he said that I could, and I went out there, well, actually a number of different times over the years. He unfortunately passed away in 2005, so it was before the first book came out. You see the timeline up there, 1909 to 2005. But he sat for several interviews, one of which, by the way, was on video. So on my website, there's a trailer to the video, which is just Drucker and title slides. But for some of these presentations, I show the full video. It's 20 minutes. It's professionally shot and edited. And it's like, what an amazing thing that I was able to do this. So for Drucker 101, he was a consultant to major corporations. I just listed a couple there, but many, many major corporations. Lots and lots of nonprofits. Again, just listed a couple, but just tons of them. One of the things I have in Create Your Future the Peter Drucker Way is kind of a list of some of the nonprofits that he consulted with. It was amazing. All, of course, pro bono work. So I listed some of those in the book, in part to show the breadth of what he did. He was an author of more than 40 books, millions of copies sold all over the world. And I should say there was a very big global aspect to what he did. He was born in Vienna, Austria. Let's see if I remember this correctly, he went to college in Germany. He went to grad school in Germany, went to England to work as a young man, and then when he was 28 years old, came to the United States. And then every year, once he got really established, every year he would do these lecture tours in the summertime when he wasn't teaching. He would do tours, I think something like maybe 1 year in Europe, 1 year in Asia. So he led definitely a pretty cool life. And so with all that, and also tons and tons of articles, along with all these books, he wrote a column for 20 years for the Wall Street Journal. He wrote for Forbes, Fortune, The Atlantic. It was pretty amazing what he did. And he taught. The Drucker School was the last place he taught at, but he taught it, when he lived in the East Coast, he taught at NYU for a number of years. He taught at a school called Bennington College in Vermont. And he taught at Sarah Lawrence, which is right outside of New York City. But the Drucker School, which is now named after him, it wasn't named after him when he first went there. That gives you kind of a quick tour. And in both books, I sort of describe more of who he was. But this legendary figure, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, that's the highest civilian honor that anybody can get in the United States, and he was awarded that. When I interviewed him for USA Today, we were staying at the same hotel in Los Angeles, and we did the interview in his hotel, partially in his hotel room, partially in a Japanese restaurant. And he said to me, when I told him I lived in Washington, he said, I'm going to be in, he said, I hardly ever travel now, but because of my age, but I'm going to be in Washington next month. He said, but I'm sworn to secrecy. I can't tell you why. And so I was wondering, what is this? And then it came out, and he couldn't say, but he was going to be awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which gave us another hook for the story, which is quite good. That's also on my site. But this whole thing of knowledge, what's this intersection between knowledge, business, and information? You have to step back a little bit now. For all these things that we take for granted in the business world, the information world, maybe dare I say it for even you folks in the law and legal world, all these things that we take for granted as part of our world, he was really the ground floor of all this. He coined the term knowledge worker in the late 50s. I mean, think about it, there really weren't that many knowledge workers in the 1950s. Before the era of personal computers, before the web, before social media, before any of that. It was still an area a world where I would say there were still a lot of blue-collar workers. Yeah, there were things like IBM and whatever, but nothing near what it is now. But he had this capacity to see things in the germ of where it was and then just see where it would go. So the whole idea of knowledge and information, I think this is one of the reasons why he had such a following in the library world and why he'd be the keynote speaker at SLA in 2002. At the age of 92, I mean, wouldn't it be great to just be so in demand that when you're 92 that somebody's going to pay you a lot of money to speak at a big conference like that? So that these things became just central to really who he was as a person, to his writing and to his teaching, and all of these things worked together in his life. The writing and the teaching, it just all blended together in a really very interesting way. And they remained components about, he wasn't just business, and he was very adamant about saying that, partially because he did that consulting for the nonprofits and for universities and things like that. But he was interested in how society itself worked and not just business. But he really, I would say most people kind of knew him, rightly or wrongly, because of business. If you go back over these 40 books, yes, quite a few of them are about business, or primarily about business, but not all of them. And I have a key in both of my books to some of the areas of looking at it topically. But for business, this whole idea of knowledge and information, that it's woven in, this is what we're doing. I mean, you think about it, everything that we're doing in terms of what a business is, how a university runs, it's all predicated on having knowledge, having information. And I think, again, that's one reason why he had this draw within the world of library and information science. So this is a very interesting book from 1969. Again, think about the world in 1969, the age of discontinuity. Today, the center is the knowledge worker, the man or woman who applies to productive work ideas, concepts, and information rather than manual skill or brawn. Now, he did point out in some of his books that, yes, for certain knowledge work, you're going to use your hands. You're going to use manual skill. He points out in more than one book, he said the extreme example of that is the neurosurgeon. Obviously, the neurosurgeon is going to work with his or her hands, but there's all sorts of knowledge work that goes with that. Just because they're good with their hands doesn't mean they're going to be a good, or even qualified to be a neurosurgeon. So there's that combination. And there are other things too, where there's manual skill involved, many doctors, dentists, whatever, lots of other people. But the main thing is that what goes behind it, the information that goes behind that, that work. In the interview that I pointed out, where I did the video interview in 2005, he mentioned to me that he had done, he was talking about the difference in automobiles. And he wrote a book called Concept of the Corporation in 1946, quite an interesting book, in which he was given carte blanche to go anywhere for a year in General Motors. I think he might have just based himself in Detroit for that year, and wrote about, it was more than General Motors, but it was kind of based on what he observed in General Motors for that year in 1946. And that book is still in print. All his books really are, as far as I know, are still in print. But he said to me in this interview that the automobile factory that he knew, that he studied in that particular year, he said it's gone. He said it's obviously it's highly computerized now. However, he said a tremendous amount of knowledge work that has to be done to go into having all that done. So this whole idea of, what are the ideas when you think about, let's say, Silicon Valley? They talk about the war for talent and how things so quickly become commoditized. So there's the things, but it's what kind of knowledge work goes behind that, and who comes up with the ideas, and who puts those ideas together. So there is a business based on them. And if we're easy, anybody can do it, but it's not. And he recognized that was the case. Information has to be organized to challenge a company's strategy. Now here again, for those of us, in the library and information science world, and in giving my brief talk about who I was, even though I'm not a day-to-day librarian as I was for 21 years at USA Today, as I said, I still teach the special libraries course. I'm the managing editor of a publication now called Leader to Leader. If anyone wants to see it, I brought a copy that I can show you. But so very often I'm going to say we in terms of the library and information science world. But when you think about this, he's not writing this for librarians. He's just not. I mean, librarians are part of the audience, obviously, but he's writing it for executives, especially people in the business world, people in the organization world. Information has to be organized. I mean, this is obviously a big part of what we do. And when you think about it, it's a big part about, to go back to the Silicon Valley companies, it's a big part about what they do. Organizing information. Isn't that part of Google's mantra? They want to organize the world's information, make it accessible, usable, whatever. One thing that I say pretty much every year to my students is that there's a disconnect here. There's a disconnect between Drucker sort of instructing this sort of thing to CEOs on one hand, and people in library and information science who know about this. They know how to do it. They know of its importance. And so you have the library world where under tremendous pressure, pressure for jobs, pressure for libraries being closed. Why is this? When the things that people within this world are really good at are the things that people like Drucker say are important. If I had the answer, I would form a consulting company and hopefully make a whole lot of money. I don't have the answer, and I don't think too many people do have the answers. But it's really something to think about. So again, that book, by the way, Management Revised Edition, 2008, it's a very large book. It's like over 500 pages, but that's actually the shorter version of a real classic book that came out in 1974 called Management Tasks, Responsibilities, Practices, 834 pages. That was my introduction to Peter Drucker in library school. The Marist building, some of you might be familiar with, the former home of LIS. So in the Marist building, and back in the 80s when I was a student here, in my library management class, Dwayne Webster, who for many years was the head of the Association of Research Libraries, is an adjunct just like I am. So Dwayne assigned a Peter Drucker book. I mean, not the whole thing. It was a summer course, not all 834 pages, but part of it, and assigned this. And I had heard of Drucker at that point, but I didn't really know him. And this just spoke to me on a really deep, deep level. There's really nothing in there specifically about libraries, but that started me on my Drucker, going to extremes with Drucker. So what they did was, I think, recognizing that in this day and age, not too many people are going to sit down with 834-page books. After he passed away, he was working on this with a man named Joe Mastroiello, a professor at the Drucker School, who was the first person I interviewed for the first book. They decided they were going to do a new edition. They were going to update things. They were going to change things, get rid of things. And then this book that came out a few years after his death, and they got it down to about 534 pages. I would recommend that it's just a fantastic book. Whether or not you think that you're interested in management or you think that you're interested in business, it just that and so many of his other books they really cross a number of disciplines, and the writing is fantastic. I mean, he's just an absolute fantastic writer. So here we skip ahead to 1988. When you think about the late 50s was the knowledge worker. Now we're 30 years later. This is another thing that he wrote about. He wrote for the Harvard Business Review, which is pretty much like almost impossible to write for. And he wrote for it over many, many years quite regularly. Businesses, especially large ones, have little choice but to become information-based. Now again, think back, 88, that wasn't as obvious as it is now. I think now it's an easier sort of sell, but when you think about in 88, 10 years before Google, before, I guess technically before the web, there were much different ways of getting information and keeping information. But he was saying then that that everything had to come from information. And I think that that's so important. I think that a lot of organizations, business and otherwise, sort of forget that, in terms of how are they going to make their money, how are they going to stay in business, how are they going to keep staying in business, how are they going to hire the right people, but that it kind of all comes from that. It comes from what the organization is. And again, as he was saying about how you were going to organize that. 1998, from Forbes ASAP. This is another thing. I hadn't looked at this article in a while. From computer literacy to information literacy. And information literacy is people within the library and information science world will tell you that that's been a big term over the years. It's a term that's in some ways a little bit hard to wrap your arms around about what it really means. So in 1998, he was talking about that, maybe not exactly in the way that people up on the third floor would talk about it, but still, in terms of what does computer literacy mean, again, back then would be much different in 98 than it would now, and information literacy. But that same idea that we're rebuilding organizations around information. And I think part of it is, yes, what you have and what you have in the form of things like patents, what you have in terms of your documents you might have, books you might have, but certainly a lot of it is that idea of the knowledge worker. And what do those knowledge workers, what do they know, and what can they keep learning, and what's the benefit of the organization? I just gave a guest talk a couple nights ago for a class up in New York at Columbia University. It was taught by Guy St. Clair, who those of us in the library world are very familiar with him. And he actually used to teach here at Catholic, but he teaches at Columbia now, and we were talking about knowledge strategies. And one of the things that came up, and it's out of our scope here now, but it's I would say still somewhat relevant, and I would think would cross over to the folks here from the law school, is, you as a knowledge worker, what knowledge do you own and can you take with you versus what is in the organization? When you think about it, and we had some pretty lively discussions about what would be relevant in terms of what what you've learned on the job, and if you were to leave that job and, let's say, start your own business or go somewhere else, I would think it's very possible that your employer might have some issues, with you about, maybe starting a business based on an idea that maybe wasn't totally your idea. We also talked about this idea of humility, which I'm not sure Drucker used exactly that term, but it was the whole idea of, you think you came up with this particular idea. Well, maybe you didn't. Maybe it's an idea that you brought a certain thing to it, but it's part of the zeitgeist, if I'm saying it correctly. That's part of something that was there that you're putting together because you've heard things from other people, you've read things, you've gotten things from databases that you accessed through because the organization provided that access to you. Really kind of a slippery slope for things like that. So this idea of where this information is, and is it in people's heads, and who owns it, and again, like a really fascinating topic. This is something else where, again, Drucker was kind of like patiently teaching this to executives. People within library school, something that you learn very early in library school is this continuum of data to information to knowledge. The way he puts it here in the Harvard Business Review article is information is data endowed with relevance and purpose, which I think is great. You hear a lot nowadays about what's the purpose? Well, why are we doing something? What is the purpose of what we're doing? And also relevance, such an important thing, certainly an important concept within library and information science, that your information is relevant, that what you do as a person is relevant. So that the data is in the wrong forms. If we had something that was just, these letters in the book, if they were just sort of strewn around in any order, wouldn't mean anything. Or another example that I used in the first book is, if you were to look at, let's say, stock tables, but you were just in the newspaper, but you just looked at numbers, and there were no words with those numbers, you wouldn't know what they were, what they represented at all. And then they come to mean something when you put the companies with it, and you can say, okay, these are stock prices, and they mean X, Y, Z. But this is a big concept within the information world. And so again, Drucker was kind of teaching that to executives. Now we have this concept of big data. You see these ads all the time in the business magazine. If you travel through National Airport, I don't know if they're still up, but I know for a long time, in one of the waiting areas, eating areas. There are all these IBM posters about smart cities and big data. IBM, which years ago, Drucker, a long time ago, he consulted for. So this idea of big data. Now this is really before Drucker's time, so I don't include it with that. But again, it's this whole thing of what can we learn from things that are out there, and how can we transform that into something that's going to be useful for a business. And again, these things are, they're not easy. If they were easy, anybody would be able to do them. 89, again, seeing Drucker as a freelance writer from New Perspective Quarterly. The Knowledge Society is a society of large organizations, government and business, that necessarily operate on the flow of information. Again, what a great thought that over the years, it's not something that he just kind of came up with once, that over the years kept on and on with this idea of information and how it flows through an organization and how people have to keep themselves relevant, just as he did. Again, as I said, in '92, the Special Libraries Association wanted him to be the keynote. He had several articles published in the last year of his life, including in the one I'm going to have on a slide coming up from Harvard Business Review. So again, we all want to be relevant as we go on, and he was somebody's extreme example of that in his 90s, that he was still relevant, that he was still publishing, that people were paying him for what he did. And I think really we may not get to anywhere near our 90s, but I think we all want to stay relevant. It's too easy to become irrelevant. And I think this is for both companies and for individuals, so we have to kind of think of it that way. Or people that say, if you're an entrepreneur, that you're really thinking of those things together. It's a great book, by the way, from 1999, Management Challenges for the 21st Century, just beginning to understand information as a tool. Again, thinking back, so it's one thing kind of when it was written, but thinking back to, again, Google only 1 year old. The web really not particularly old. When I think back to, let's say, in, when I was here in the 80s in library school as a library student, where there was online information, but it was just so much different. Even some of these companies still exist, but the way, LexisNexis and Dow Jones, there are companies called Factiva, and it's still a really interesting way to search, but they adapted it for the web. But I think a key thing in terms of when we talk about information and how it's accessible and being proprietary is for things like that, for LexisNexis, Factiva, Dialog, some of their competitors, is their access through the web, but it's certainly not free. So you have this huge mass of material, much of it very good, that's available on the open web. Then you have all these other things that are proprietary. I would venture to think for the folks here from the law school that there's all sorts of cool things that you have access to right now as a student, or if you're faculty or whatever, that when you graduate, you're not going to, at least not free access to those. And so there's a big difference after my 21 years at USA Today, when we had access to all sorts of great databases, and then one day you're there and one day you're not, and suddenly it dawns on you, like, oh my God, I don't have access to all these great databases. So it's really something to think about in terms of how accessible this information is. I think a lot of people outside of organizations, outside of academia, don't always think about that idea of the accessibility of information. There's a lot of scholarly literature that's just totally not, it's just not available through, again, it may come from the web. Somebody's got to pay for it somewhere. This is that article I was referring to from not too long before he died, What Makes an Effective Executive. Their action plans, and again, their information needs understood, that as executives, that they had to interact with people. This article, by the way, it's quite a long article, and the best way to get this article is a great book called The Effective Executive, originally came out in 1967, and what they did is, after, I forget the year, maybe 2008 or so, they put out a new edition, and what they did is they took the old Effective Executive and then they put this on as the preface. And I would definitely recommend having that book anyway, but especially that edition that has this article in it. So again, thinking about what these information needs are, and for people within the library and information science world especially, this idea of working with folks like this, of getting them the right information, which in some ways means really knowing your topic well enough that you can, whatever that might be, that you're getting them the right information. Here's another, data literate. This is different from the other article that I mentioned before. Information literate needs to learn to ask, again, these are kind of like library science 101, I would think. What information do we need in this company? When do we need it? In what form? And I think that's a big issue. I think it used to be years ago, there'd be a little bit more of the paper forms of it now, maybe less so, but certainly not totally. When do we need it, in what form, and where do we get it? Now, you could extrapolate this any way you want. For organizations, one way you would think is through things like corporate libraries. But as I said, those unfortunately are becoming endangered species. Hopefully, people within the library school here figure out ways to make so there's kind of a renaissance in that. But again, think this is 1992, but the needs are still there. But this is before the web. Again, in a company, let's say, you certainly, if somebody paid for it, you'd have access to LexisNexis and things like that. But now, of course, it's much different because people within organizations, not only do they have that, but they have all sorts of things that they can get for free. And of course, a big problem is people thinking that just that free web stuff is good enough, which sometimes it is, but very often it's not. I like to say that Drucker had sort of this tough love approach with executives. It can be very tough on them. This was something that the Executive in Action is 3 books that were put together and put out in 1996, but he wrote a new preface to it. And within that, I thought this was really tough medicine for people to hear. The seemingly most successful business today is a sham and a failure if it does not create its own and different tomorrow. It must innovate and recreate its products or services, but equally the enterprise itself. And we've seen this on and on. That was 96. We've seen this in so many ways since then. We saw it with the bookstores, just all sorts of things that didn't, that sort of now exist, but in much different forms. 1996, I believe Amazon was, 2 years old? Very, very many of those bookstores that existed back then do not, and successful ones at the time, they just don't exist anymore. And look what happens with things like, as companies, BlackBerry, where, BlackBerry was the king of what they did. And suddenly, a company, Apple that wasn't even in that business kind of created something pretty much different that changed that business. So again, he wasn't talking about any one organization here. But when you think about it, it becomes an information problem. Information, data, knowledge, however you want to put it. Where are these things going to come from? He had something called the future that's already happened. And I wrote about a lot in the book. He didn't exactly say to you, how do you find it? But the whole idea of the future that's already happened is what are things that are already out there that the changes haven't quite solidified yet? And how can you take advantage of those things? He was very big in this idea of converting problems into opportunities. That yes, you could think of them as problems for a while, but you think of them as opportunities. If you have a chance to find on the web, one of the things I was looking at before I was preparing for this was every year they have the Edwin L. Godkin Lecture at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. So in 1994, he gave that talk. Really, really interesting stuff. And again, in some ways it doesn't really date. And of course, that was given a couple years before the Executive in Action. So I want to leave time for Q&A and also for, we have tons of pizza that we need to eat. So again, I think this is a really interesting topic. It's, not something you can capture so much in just a half hour or so. Also, for those of you who don't know me, please, or whether you do or do not know me, please email me. Please connect with me on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Twitter. And I thank you for being here, but I do want to have Q&A. And remember, since I do teach here, I'll call on people if I don't get Q&A. So any questions about either how Drucker approached this or anything that I...
Well, first, what's your Twitter address?
Oh, Twitter, it's my name, so it's at Bruce Rosenstein. And I'm very active on all three, especially Twitter. One of my former students called me a Twitter machine, and I don't have any, I don't set them for a certain time or whatever. It's just, I get the muse and I do it. So, and I do, I try to do a Drucker quote every day, as well as on LinkedIn and on Facebook. And of course, the Twitter ones obviously have to be shorter, so the ones I do on LinkedIn and Facebook tend to be longer. But I do lots of other stuff as well. And like, one of the things that appealed to me about Drucker is, Drucker, to me, I call him, kind of the patron saint of intellectual curiosity. He's interested in all sorts of different things, and I am as well. So when you pick up a Drucker book, there's like all sorts of topics that he's writing about, not just business, not just organizations. So I write. It's one way of saying that on my tweets that I'm tweeting about all sorts of things. So yes, at Bruce Rosenstein.
Yeah, he writes about all kinds of things, but I can't find much on his faith, though.
On his faith? Yeah. Well, okay. Here's one. You have to be really self-promotional if you're going to put out books. In chapter 5 of Create Your Future the Peter Drucker Way, I have a chapter called Build Your Future Beyond Your Current Workplace, and I deal with the topic of Drucker and faith because it's a big topic, and it's now becoming, there's some scholarly literature on it. I've talked to some of the people who've written about it. It's a topic that's interesting to me, but I had to preface it in the book by saying, I'm not a theologian, I'm not a scholar of religion or spirituality. However, because it's of interest to me, first of all, I noted some of these things. I talked about some of the things where he did, he was I think he didn't want to come out a lot and talk specifically about his own faith, because I think for lots of reasons, that he didn't want to maybe turn some people off. He didn't want to, who knows, he didn't want to proselytize. But the fact of the matter is, you go to the indexes of his books and you'll just see tons of references to religion and spiritual things. One of the big articles was, and this article has been anthologized in a number of books. It was a Kierkegaard-related article, and it started life. I discovered it started life as a speech when he was up at Bennington. Then it became an article, and it went out in a number of books. But it was about faith. It was written in the 40s, and then in one of his books called Ecological Vision, where that appeared, it was that and other articles. He had a preface to that part where he kind of talked a bit more about his faith. So I also have references. If I'm a librarian, I have to have good references, right? So I have a lot of references within here. So I reference that literature, not only that article, but some of the articles written about him, and then some of the other things within, loosely speaking, the faith world that I felt applied to it. I also feel that, to me, part of that world is betterment of oneself as an individual, and he was hugely into that. Now, also within that, lots of people in that world gravitated to him. The big obvious example is Rick Warren, who wrote The Purpose-Driven Life. There's that purpose word again, which I believe is something like the biggest selling hardback book in history. Pastor of Saddleback Church in California, and he's a huge Drucker guy. He took some classes, Drucker school. Drucker did some consulting. Drucker was a friend of his, and so I reference, he's been interviewed and talked about Drucker's effect on him. So, but there are other people too. A lot of people in that mega church world that Drucker did consulting for. So I talk a little bit about that. So, it's not like he's trying to teach them faith or religion. That's not his business. That's for them to do. But as far as how can they further their purpose of what they're doing by organizing their work better and doing it better and identifying things like purpose better, that he could help them with. So I think if you see some of these, and I can also separately email you some of these. I might not have links, but I can at least point out some of these things. And so thank you for asking that. Other questions? Yes.
A couple slides ago, you think it was a quote about businesses, it's a sham or a failure if they're not like improving, and I guess in staying ahead of the times or whatever else.
Right.
Did Peter Drucker have suggestions or examples of how to do that? Like how businesses could do that? Or?
He didn't spell out. You'd almost have to go. I have to really think hard about that, because a lot of it is there, and it's a matter of just pulling out the relevant parts of those books. I think especially that particular one, because that book called The Effective Executive is one of the 3 things anthologized there. One of the things he said was organizing yourself however it is you did it for change, because lots of people felt that, you'd get to a plateau and kind of stay there, but he said you need to have constant change. So, looking out for however it is you would identify things that were going to be changes that were out there on the horizon. One thing he said, just at a real basic level, was that too many executives kind of hid behind the desk. And he said, and he talked about this in some of his books, where he said, you've got to get out there. He said you should go out on sales calls, you should go out and, trade, well, maybe not trade jobs because somebody else isn't going to be the CEO. But, you go out and work somebody's job for a while or shadow them on the job and see how the customers are feeling. He was also very big on that, you're being involved in other organizations while you're working. So let's say you're doing volunteering, you're on boards, and then you're going to meet people that you wouldn't meet otherwise, and you're going to hear about things that are going on that you wouldn't hear otherwise. Also, I put in a plug in my first book for adjunct teaching, which I started doing when I was at USAT, and it's to me it's a great way of doing things that you otherwise wouldn't normally do, and using parts of your being that you wouldn't ordinarily use. But I think, with Drucker, there is a lot of, even though there's all the books, there's also a lot of free material on the web. And I think if you look at it within that lens, thinking about that some of those things will kind of jump out at you as important things about how do you change. Because I think partially what you're saying is how do you change before you, quote, need to, right? Because when you need to, it's too late. It's how do you do it ahead of time, and you don't want to throw out necessarily the baby with the bathwater, but there was a story that I read, an article that I read, where was it? Maybe in The Economist. Now I can't remember, which Drucker also used to write for, by the way. But he was talking about Microsoft before in the 90s, when they were averse to anything that would, detract from Windows. And that, ultimately caused a lot of problems for them. And the new CEO is, kind of broadening beyond that. But, in retrospect, it probably would have been nice to start changing some things before that. So again, Drucker wasn't talking about that at all. But I'm kind of using that as an example about when you're really successful, or think about the car companies in the 90s. I'm sure they all thought, hey, we're really successful. And then some of them had to be bailed out by the government. So I think it's, what you've identified there is how do you do that? How do you do it before it's too late? If you're a bookstore chain, and if you're Borders, and you think, wow, we're doing really well, we're going to just keep opening up stores and all sorts of things, and then you're out of business. So it's a real challenge. So thank you for that question. We probably have time for a question or two more. Joan?
Yeah, how would you differentiate, if at all, between virtual online types of organizations? How would Drucker look at the Amazon versus the Borders, brick and mortar?
Yeah.
Maybe extend that onto libraries, virtual change management, executive leadership and management of virtual organizations that are so, prevalent.
think that he, and again, I don't want to ever put words in his mouth, partially because he could be a very contrarian guy, and you'd think he'd think one way, and then he would think another. But I think one way of answering that in staying true to Drucker's work is that he felt everything was a people business, right? It was all about the people who were in there, or who could be in there, or who could start a business. So it then becomes for those people, how, we've got this purpose of what it is we're doing, and then what's the expression of that? Is the expression that we're totally online? Is the expression that, well, maybe we're going to have some bricks and mortar part of it too? I mean, I think for Amazon, when you think there's still a lot of physical, even if they don't have stores, there's a lot of physical stuff that they're selling, and it has to, get somewhere. So it's this, what is the best way of doing it? Or let's say like with Netflix, where the beginning was the physical discs, and yes, they're still part of it, but then going to the streaming. So I think he would say, what is the best expression of what we can do now, but also that we can do for the future if we identify our purpose, let's say as, for a bookstore chain, that, we're selling information in different forms. And here we have, and I think to me this Monroe Street market is such a great example of, information, of transforming what were ideas and concepts and information into that physical presence that's so much different now. So as we know, part of that is Barnes & Noble. Barnes & Noble still has their issues as a corporation, but they're still in existence, and Border is not. So, how do we get to the point where Barnes & Noble, they're still kind of fighting, but they're in this cool, quarter where presumably people want to be and businesses want to be, and that they're a big presence, and that it's thought, people think well of them, that they're in that area. So I think it's, what are you doing? And nobody, I imagine at Barnes & Noble, they're not thinking of going into maybe radically different things, but look at Google and driverless cars, things like that, where Google, long ago said, we're not just going to be a search engine company, we're going to get involved in all these other things. So, but again, I think he would say about it being a people issue. And again, one thing I really wanted to drive home when I was saying about people like Rick Warren is that many of the people who gravitated to Peter and who he gravitated to were very, very high-level people. They were the CEOs, they were the presidents, they were the prime ministers, whatever. And I think there's something significant about that they gravitated to him and he gravitated to them. He wrote, the closest he came to a memoir was a book in 1978 called Adventures of a Bystander, which I think is like a great title to begin with. But just kind of talking about some of the people that he was friends with over the years, there's a great chapter on, do people here know who, two names, Buckminster Fuller and Marshall McLuhan. People in the information world should, certainly know about Marshall McLuhan, but those two names, like very iconic people, no longer alive. And he was friends with both of those people before he died. And there's a great chapter in Adventures of a Bystander about them. Sam, do we have time for one? I mean, I know we have pizza here and water and what have you, but do we have time for one more question? Do we have? Would any of the law folks like to, or other law folks like to ask a question? I think he actually, one of his degrees is in something like, it was when he was in Germany, it's something like a doctor of law in something like maritime law or something like this. This would have been something in the 1930s. I don't even know if there is a degree like that. So if he were here now and if he could magically see this, I would think he would say it was really cool that we had people here from the law school. Sam, well, and I guess, Sam, it might be hard for you to, or would you like to do a question? Can you do it with? Okay.
How would Drucker go about facilitating knowledge sharing between executives and the partners and the regular workers on the field? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think that one thing he would do is to maybe try to intentionally bring people together again, together a lot. And I think whether or not this was done through a corporate library, when he spoke to SLA, he said one of the first things that he did when he had consulting assignments was to go to the corporate library and say, hey, I know nothing about this topic. Can you help get me up to speed? Tell me what I need to read, whatever, before I go in and talk to these folks. But we know in a perfect world there would be one, but maybe there's not. So I think that he would try to get people to come together, to bring them together in some ways. Maybe it's to have a speaker, maybe it's to have some sort of brown bag, maybe it's to have just discussions on topics, and to maybe see that if there could be some flow that way, and some of the things of saying, when you meet people that you otherwise wouldn't meet, and say, well, maybe this is a source of information for me, or those people could then volunteer information to the executives. One of the things I wrote about in the second book is this, is anybody familiar with this? It's not a Drucker construct, but the folks who do it are kind of big Drucker people. Appreciative inquiry, does that ring a bell with anyone here? It's associated with a professor at Case Western named David Cooperrider. It's really interesting stuff. The whole idea of appreciative inquiry is, instead of focusing on what's wrong and what are our problems, it's focusing on what's going well, so we can identify those islands of excellence and see how it could be applied elsewhere, and to see if there are things that people know that they could really help somebody in another department, let's say, or the CEO or president or whatever, that they didn't know about. So David Cooperrider, he's done some, I think he was there was a title like maybe Scholar in Residence at the Drucker School at Claremont, and he did that at one point. I've never met him, but I mentioned him and appreciative inquiry in the book. So I think those sorts of constructs can be very helpful. And also being positive about it. I think even though Drucker was using that tough love thing, I think he agreed that positive thinking was good. I mean, whether or not he called it that instead of relentlessly focusing on problems, that you focus on where are some positives within this, where are some opportunities, including societal problems. And yes, there are problems, but are there things that we can do, and maybe even build a business on or a nonprofit on, that would help with those problems? So I can, as some people know, I can talk like all night about these topics, but I think we'll probably have to stop there. Please stay in touch. I do have a lot of material on my website, including some videos. And I guess, Sam, if this video comes out well enough, we could put it on, or at least put a link to it on the site. I will be teaching, for those of you who know people within the Library of Information Science, one floor above, I will be teaching the Special Library Information Center course this summer. We need students. I'm using this, I like to think of this as a recruiting tool. So if you think of people who might like to take the course, it starts June 30th, ends on August 6th, or people who can somehow, magically through another department come in and take the course. It's something I really love teaching and really enjoy. Sam was one of my students this year, and so he and Anita were, or in 2014, I mean, he and Anita were kind enough to organize this. So please partake of more of our food and drink, and thank you all very much for being here.